Hello and welcome. Well, this is intended to be the second part of a reflection on the relationship between Christianity and Islam. And the moment we're talking about this is a period between the local elections in the United Kingdom and the general election. And one of the things we've observed is that this coming general election, Islam is beginning to emerge as a political force. This was foreseen already by Houellebecq, who wrote his extraordinary novel Submission. And it might just be worth reflecting on what he saw coming in France. There are more Muslims in France than there are in the UK. And first of all, the background to this is, of course, that Islam is as much a political force as it is a religious one. Houellebecq's book Submission was published on the very day of the Charlie Hebdo murders, as it happens by some extraordinary piece of intense synchronicity, we might call it. And his hero is a French university lecturer, and he's choosing essentially between Islam, Christianity, and the French existential crisis. What Houellebecq had seen was that there come a point when Islam would enter French political life with a Muslim party. And so he placed it in the previous French election. He was wrong about the timing, but he may not be wrong about the principle. Essentially, the left were losing power in the novel, and desperate to stop Le Pen and the National Front gaining power. So they decided to ally with the emerging Muslim party. And the Islamic party said, all we want as the price of this coalition is control over education. You can deal with the economy, with foreign policy, with domestic issues, but we want education. We want all of it. The deal was struck, the election was won, and Islam then took over French education. And all the teachers were sacked and invited to reapply as Muslims if they wanted their job. The effects of this are really very powerful. And the hero of the book, or the central character, has to decide who he is and what he wants, what priorities he wants to live his life. But it's become clear already from the local elections in this country, where the Green candidate in Leeds said, "This is for Gaza," and shouted Allahu Akbar as his election was won, that we're going to find an emerging Islamic influence as the left in particular caught Muslim votes. I don't want to get into politics, but George Galloway has seriously changed the balance of power with his own party. And none of us knows what's going to happen, except that the influence of Islam is going to grow, and that there will be a price that Muslims require the people they ally themselves with to pay. In the last couple of days, Angela Rayner has been seen sitting in a room soft soaping the Muslim men that were there. There were no Muslim women allowed there at all. She shows no signs of embarrassment about that. Let's reflect on what the constituent elements are that go into this. First of all, we might say that the difficulties we face with the coming of Islam have nothing to do with Muslims. We don't hold Muslims responsible. Nigel Farage, in his discussion with Trevor Phillips, was being set up every time by Trevor Phillips to say, you just don't like Muslims, do you? And I think it's probably helpful for most of this conversation to do this in terms of the three personages behind the crisis that we have, and they are Marx, Mohammed and Jesus. If we compare Jesus to Mohammed, that gets us out of the serious complexities of describing collectively Christians or collectively Muslims. It also gets us out of the complexity of thinking that we know what Christianity is in terms of explaining with sound bites, and knowing that we know what Islam is and using sound bites. But for the moment, what we have is these three seminal figures, Jesus, Mohammed and Marx, and their followers. And for those of you who've been following me here, you know that for some time I've been saying that Mohammed and Marx have entered into a coalition, and that together they intend to destroy, diminish, contain Jesus and the Christian culture he's responsible for. the left have gone a very long way towards doing that, and it's been taking place over the last 100 years. Enormous pressure from secularism, in particular, on Christianity, which Christians have failed to resist very well. And the fact that we are where we are is essentially God's judgment on Christians for not believing, for not loving, for not believing, for not praying, for not witnessing, for not refusing to compromise with secular materialism. It's our fault. We don't blame Muslims. We blame our lack of commitment to Jesus. But that could change. And indeed, one of the things we're trying to do is to see if there's a way in which we can change the courage of the church, the vision of the church, the commitment of the church. And perhaps I think that's probably one of the most important things that I want to say as part of these conversations. That's what we intend to do. We intend to be better Christians as a response to this crisis. Because there are other responses. But let's go back for the moment to Marx, Mohammed and Jesus. Marx and Mohammed have got this coalition going. They've won. The Jesus people have given way. And both Marx and Mohammed know that there's going to be conflict between the two of them to become for the top spot. The Marxists, who we're using this word very loosely to define everyone on the left, so very careless, but this is a cartoon pencil picture. The Marxists misunderstand Islam. They never understood Christianity, and they understand Islam even less. And they think that Islam is a form of slightly primitive Arabian Judeo-Christianity. They think it will become secularized and seduced by materialism and politics, as Christianity did. But they seriously underestimate it. And Islam knows that they've underestimated it. All that Islam needs to do is to wait. And during this waiting period, their numbers will grow enormously. And one of the great secrets that they have is the theological principle of abrogation. Now, a lot of people don't understand what this means, but essentially it reflects the fact that the Quran is written in two styles, or two pieces, basically early and late. The early part is the bit that was written in Mecca, and it's on the whole quite ironic. It was a period when Muhammad was interested in cooperating with Jews to some extent, though he always hated the Jews, we might come back to that, and the Christians, when he was trying to effectively act as a prophet, a religious figure. And then there's a period when he went to Medina where he acted as a warlord. He was a failure as a prophet. He was very successful as a warlord. It would be tempting to say that Islam is more robust as a political movement than it is as a religious or spiritual movement, but I'm not sure that's fair, and nor do I think I know enough about it to make that comment, although I'm deeply attracted to Sufism at one level, and I'm aware of course, of profound religious virtues in Islam, but the purpose of this talk is not to describe them for the moment. And the theology of abrogation is that everything that comes in the Quran is subject to a later verse. So, for example, there are some very ironic and nice verses at the beginning of the Quran, but the more violent ones come at the end. And the problem this presents us with is that every time there is an Islamic renewal, or if like a fortification of Islamic resolve, and you have, let's say, rather nice and kind Muslims who are well suited to a non-Islamic culture, living happily with their neighbours, not observing the Quran methodically or meticulously, they're deeply vulnerable to more radical Muslims, as we call them, but we should really call them more committed Muslims, saying you have to be more meticulous in your observance of Quranic discipline. In other words, if there's a movement in Islam, it's always towards the more radical, the more violent, the more committed end of things, which is why there is nothing in our history that we can point to where we can see Islam being reformed. There are no reforms of Islam. There is only radicalization of Islam. It only works one way, because of the theology or the theological principle of abrogation. Very few people understand this. I was once asked by the Times to write a Thunderer column on it, and I did, but it passed without much effect or note. But what it does mean is that very nice liberal Christians and very nice liberal secularists look at their Muslim neighbours and think, well, these are lovely and charming people to live amongst, good neighbours, and we can count on them to be moderate and kind and sociable people. We don't have to worry too much. It's only the Islamists we worry about. But Islamism is a construct of journalistic intrigue. There is no such thing as Islamism. It was a word invented in order to pretend that political extremists amongst Muslims were some kind of separate phenomenon, detached from the rest of Islam, and that they were not the normative thing you had to worry about. Because, of course, if the terrorists, if the murderers, if the people who blew things up, if the executors were really representative of Islam, well, people in the West would have got worried. And so this fiction of Islamism was produced in order to pretend that that wasn't the case. But it's a fiction. And one of the things the left is going to do is to discover that when Islam begins to grow in numerical strength and in political muscle, it will be facing a kind of Islam that, as the statistics that we looked at in the earlier video show, that young Muslims, the next generation, are going to want Sharia law. They're going to want some of the more brutal remedies the Quran dishes out for adultery, for apostasy. You know what they are. So things are really only going to get worse. What can be done about any of this? Well, this really is the point, I think, of the video. The only time that Islam was repulsed, well, there have been two times that we know about, but the only time recently. One, of course, is Charles Martel, who won a great battle near Tours in the first millennium. And the second is the Reconquista in Spain. So it simply is a fact that Islam responds to being overwhelmed by military might, but not much else. We have to, for a moment, mention the Crusades, which of course have been subject to the most terrible revisionist history. The Crusades were a defence movement by Christianity to expansionistic military Islam. And lots of things have been said by historians who say, well, actually, when Muslims took over the Middle East, because they did take it over by invasion, they proved to be very congenial, and they allowed pilgrims to continue to visit, and commercial ties and so on. Actually, the way in which Islam succeeded was to, on the backs of Christian bureaucrats, particularly in North Africa. But that's, again, another separate area of knowledge. For the moment, what we have to notice is that these attempts to repulse the Islamic invasion of the Holy Land, the disastrous building of a mosque on the site of the temple, the Islamification of Jerusalem, these defensive sorties failed. And also, to some extent, left Christianity with a bad name, although the Islamic world, although it pretends to be infuriated by, well, it is infuriated by the Crusades. It forgot what they were. It had to it relearned them, and then, courtesy of revisionist historians in the West, took them as a source of great offence. But we failed in the Crusades to defend with might, with physical military might, the Holy Land, and the Christian presence around the Mediterranean, which was simply completely, almost on the south side, at least in Africa, disappeared. Should we be thinking of some kind of military or physically violent response? The difficulty with this is that as a young Englishman, I think I'd have been very attracted to that. And as you know, there are young Englishmen who are attracted to that. But as a Christian, I think I have to say that I don't think it's an option for practicing Christians. There's nothing that Jesus taught that gives us a platform for fighting people. On the contrary, all the evidence is that only becoming more profoundly Christian can those people who see themselves as our enemies be changed. I've had one or two extraordinary testimonies about terrorists, Muslim terrorists, who were in prison and who encountered Jesus in the night in their prison. I'm thinking of one particular who is now a pastor on the west coast of Canada. the number of people who've been involved in terrorism both at a family and at a personal level, who've converted to Christianity and talked about the way in which they prefer Jesus to Mohammed. And this, I think, is our strategy. We don't run Islam down. We don't run Muslims down. But what we do is to compare Mohammed and Jesus together. Because Jesus forgave people and healed people and resurrected people. Mohammed effected revenge and overcame people by force. He killed people and he became a warlord. And as we look at these two figures, the ethics, the examples that they give, it seems to me that we have such an obvious advantage in the attraction of Jesus that it's one we shouldn't fail to use. We should be confident that all Muslims are made in the image of God and that they have a vulnerability to being loved and forgiven and saved, as all non-Muslims do as well. And so what we should be doing is telling Muslims about Jesus. We might want to pursue certain apologetic tasks. There are real difficulties about the way in which the Quran can be attributed to Muhammad. I think the gap between Muhammad's life and the first Quran we have is about 200 years. It's really quite a long time. Do you remember the trick the German theologians tried to play on us with Chinese whispers, telling us that the Gospels were written 1 or 2 or 3 generations later than the life of Jesus himself? John Robinson, an Anglican biblical scholar and philosopher, put a very persuasive case that they'd been all written before 70 AD because none of them mention the fall of Jerusalem. And even if you do allow that John is later, and there's no reason why you have to, there's no evidence for it being much later. And so the relationship between the Gospels and the life of Jesus can be anywhere between 20 years to 40 years. 200 years is altogether different. and the question is, if Muhammad, who describes himself as being illiterate, didn't write it, who in that 200-year period did? But however we approach this, what we're committing ourselves to do is to win Muslims by prayer and by sanctity and by witness. Jesus has got there ahead of us. The number of Muslims who talk about having dreams of Jesus and being affected by meeting Jesus grows exponentially all the time. One of my friends is involved with some underground evangelists in Iraq, and they say that in some places the population is Muslim by daytime but Christian by nighttime. In the daytime they allow themselves to be constrained by Muslim sociological culture, but in the nighttime they pull out the Gospels they've got and have Bible studies and develop a relationship with Jesus. Well, I can't say how widespread this is or where it will go, but I'm not remotely surprised. What we have to do in the West is pray for a renewal in the church, a renewal of sanctity, a renewal of miracles, a renewal of the supernatural. The supernatural is on our side. There are no stories anywhere of Christians having dreams of Mohammed who appears to them in a way that is so deeply attractive that they change their faith. The supernatural agenda is entirely one way, whereas there are a great many accounts of Muslims encountering Jesus in their dreams and elsewhere and discovering that he is indeed the Son of God and that they're more profoundly attracted to him than they are to the Prophet Muhammad. So what can we do about this? We have to evangelize, we have to pray, we have to purify ourselves, we have to repent. Is the West going to be lost? Well, it might be. Everything depends upon the integrity of Christians. But if the church finds its vigour, finds its faith, rediscovers a relationship of intimate trust with Jesus, which is the foundation from which miracles most easily flow, then we can convert our Muslim neighbours to a living relationship with Jesus and introduce them to the Catholic Church. This ought to be our goal and our aim, and one that is far more likely to be blessed by God than some form of civil war. If we fail, then it's almost certain that what will happen in our country is some form of partitioning. We've seen this. We will become the new Lebanon. There will be Muslim areas that are governed by Sharia law. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, quite presciently foresaw this when he gave a jurisprudential lecture to some jurists a while ago, saying that it was the requirement of the host country to recognise the existence of Sharia law and Sharia courts under the surface of English society. That's certainly a common sense approach, even if it's not one that appeals to me in the slightest. But it has the virtues of being realistic and accommodating, if that's what you want. But because of demography, the new Muslim citizens of this country are having larger families and children very quickly. And because of democracy, we are in a crisis where there is no conservative political force at all. It's lost confidence, and under the utterly incompetent and irresponsible care of the Conservative Party, it's simply evaporated. So there appears to be no political presence on the right, the conserving side, because it's Christian culture you would want to conserve. And the left, through some extraordinary acceleration, has taken control of the minds of the young and of culture. That long march through the institutions has been immensely successful. So for Christians, we have to confront the left, though they appear to be winning hands down. But once again, they're all people who need God, who are made in the image of God, who are made for God and are restless and hungry and miserable until they encounter him. And there's Islam. What we should do is stop collapsing, stop giving way, stop being corrupted, stop losing faith, stop being unclear. We must pray for renewal of the church. We must walk with Jesus and confront both Marx and Mohammed, both of whom have a great deal of blood on their hands, as the political experiments that they have launched into our culture have been effected at the edge of the sword or the guillotine or the gulag. We, on the other hand, are heading for heaven. We'd like our journey to be comfortable. We'd like to be able to live in the cultures we grew up in, but they're not our first priority. Our first priority is the kingdom of heaven. Our first priority is to be close to Jesus. The only question is by what route he calls us there, and how faithful we manage to be while we're travelling that route on our pilgrimage. God bless you. God keep you. Keep the faith. Keep praying.